Here I'll give you many different if statement examples in Excel. I'll start very simple with very simple criteria, build up to adding comparison operators and putting functions within the if statement, as well as nested if statements, multiple conditions, and nested if statements with multiple conditions. So it'll get a little bit complex, but not too difficult to follow. Before we start, check the video description and click the link to TeachExcel so you can download the files for the tutorial and follow along. To start, remember that the if statement or if function is made up of three simple parts. You've got the logical test argument, that's the first part of it. That's the part that has to evaluate to either true or false. So it could be something as simple as does 1 equal 1? The next part is what you want to do if the first part equals true. In these examples, I'm going to do very simple, just output a true. And then the third part or argument is what to output if the very first part evaluates to false. Here I'll keep it simple as well and just make it output false. So very simple with the if statement. Now let's get started with some examples. Over here I've got a little table of values and we'll use that for the if statements. Let's start very simple, equals if, logical test, always the first argument. Let's test if this cell equals red. So equals, remember quotation marks always around text for the logical test. Let's just output true and false to make it easy. And of course, it contains the text red. Very quickly for the next one, see if this cell contains 15. Remember, for numbers, you don't have to put quotation marks around the number. Not a problem. True, false, bam. So, very simple if statement. Now let's move up to comparison operators. You've got the greater than, less than, greater than or equal to, less than or equal to, and, often forgotten, not equals to. So a less than and a greater than sign back to back. Let's start with a very simple comparison operator, equals if, open parentheses, logical test. Let's test if this cell here is greater than 10. So greater than sign, 10, comma, what to output if it evaluates to true. Let's just output true. What to output if it evaluates to false. Let's output false. And you can see it is greater than 10. Let's take a look at it. So right here, you've got the cell reference, the cell that contains 15, and then you have the comparison operator. So we want to check if cell E3 is greater than 10. You could also check if it was less than 10, or less than or equal to 10, or greater than or equal to 10. And since it is a number, we do not put quotation marks around the 10. Now let's use the comparison operator with text, equals if. Let's test if this cell here does not equal red. So less than, greater than sign for does not equal. Then remember quotation marks around the text. And we'll just output true for the value if true and false for the value if false. So does E2 not equal red? And the answer is false. The only difference here between text and numbers is you do have to put the quotation marks around the text. However, unlike a function like the SUMIFS function, you do not put the comparison operators within the quotation marks. If that's a little bit confusing, just watch one of the SUMIFS tutorials and you'll understand what I mean. Now let's go ahead and put a function within the if statement, equals if. Let's check if the sum of these two cells, E3 and F3, is greater than 40. So we use the sum function, just type it in there like any other function, open parentheses. Make sure to close the parentheses, easy to forget that. So is the sum function greater than 40? Let's output a true if it is, and a false if it is not. False because 15 plus 20 is 35. So to nest a function, it's as simple as just typing that function within the other function. In this case, the sum function within the if function or if statement. And it's the comparison operator here, the greater than, greater than or equal to, less than or equal to, or not equals to, that makes this right here a condition that will evaluate to true or false. Now I showed you how to check if a cell contains certain text, but you may have noticed that that check is case insensitive. So if I make this capital, our first formula right here, where it's a lowercase r, still evaluates to true. Now let's go ahead and make that test case sensitive. So it must exactly match. We do equals if, and then we're going to use the function exact, which is going to check to make sure that the text is exactly the same, including the case. So for the text that we want to check, let's use a capital RED, and then let's select this cell right here. Now the exact function already returns a true or a false, so we don't need to use any comparison operators or anything like that to make it a condition. Comma, output true if it's true, false if it's false. And we get false because there's no capital R over here. So we make it a capital R and it evaluates to true. And this one doesn't change at all because remember, it's case insensitive. Make that a little R again. Now let's go to using multiple conditions for the logical test. So we could say, let's test if this cell is red and this cell is greater than 20 or less than 10 or whatever you want. But we have two conditions to test instead of just one. Let's go here and use the AND function. Now the AND function will make sure that every test within it evaluates to true. If all the tests within it evaluate to true, the AND function returns true. If any of them within it evaluates to false, then it's going to return false. So the first test, let's check if this is red. For the second test, let's check if this is 15. Now both of these tests will evaluate to true, so the AND function will return true. So let's output true for true, false for false, and there we go. So let's make one of them false just so you can see that. If E3 does not equal 15, now we have one test that will return false, so the whole thing will return false. That's using the AND function. It's a very, very important function to use to make more powerful if statements. The next very powerful function to use is the OR function. So equals if, or, open parentheses, and this is going to check if any one of the arguments, if any one of the logical tests or conditions evaluates to true. So let's test if this cell equals red, and then let's check if this cell does not equal 15. True and false. Here we should still get true because one of the conditions evaluates to true within the OR function. Now if both conditions evaluated to false, then you would get a false value returned. The first couple times that you use the AND the OR function, it might be a little bit confusing, but just go slow and eventually you'll get it and you'll see how helpful it can be. It allows you to test multiple conditions, generally as many as you'd like within reason, in one single if statement. Now let's kick it up a notch and see if the user entered enough text in this cell over here. Let's say you've got a form, questionnaire, invoice, whatever, and the user has to enter more than just OK. You want to do a little check for that. Use the if statement, and let's put the len function inside of it, L-E-N. It's going to tell you how many characters are inside of a specific cell. So we select the cell with the text, close parentheses, and now we need to use a comparison operator so that it will output a true or a false. So let's say if it equals greater than 5 characters, because we assume that if the user entered at least 5 characters, then they basically put enough information within that cell. Output a true if it evaluates to true, false if it evaluates to false. And it's true because they put enough text over here. Let's say they just put OK, which is not good enough for us. Then we get a false. Now let's check if a cell begins with certain text. Equals if. This time we're going to use the left function. The left function will get so many characters from the left of a cell. Open parentheses, select the cell with the text. Comma, how many characters do we want to get? Let's just get the first word, which in this case is this. So we do 4 characters. THIS is 4. Close parentheses. Now let's check if the first 4 characters of this cell evaluate or are the word this. Remember, it's not case sensitive by default, so I don't have to put a capital T here to match the this in this cell. Now let's output a true if the cell does start with this. Output a false if it does not start with this. And true because it does. So just to test it, let's change one of the first four characters. And you can see it evaluates to false. Change that back. Now let's do the same thing, but to get the value from the end of the cell equals if. This time we use the right function to get values from the right of the cell. Select the cell that has the text, comma, how many characters do we want to get? Now I'll show you an example of a common mistake here. Let's say we want to get the last 4. We think that's going to be the last word in the cell. So close parentheses, and I want to check if the last word is idea. Let's output true if it is, and false if it isn't. Oh no, it isn't. What happened? Well, remember, most of the time if you type a sentence, you're going to have a period at the very end of the cell. So that counts as one of the characters. So when we said to get the last 4 characters, what happened is we got DEA period. Now we can use the mid function in order to get idea instead of just the last characters of the cell or the first characters, but I'm not going to cover that in this tutorial. Basically, just know that you can use any of the text manipulation functions within the if statement in order to check if a cell has that specific text. The mid function is a bit more complicated than I want to get into in this tutorial, so I'll include that in another tutorial for advanced if functions. And in the next example, I'll show you how to find a word that's placed anywhere within a cell. So let's say we want to figure out if this cell contains the word good. That's the keyword we want. Let's make sure it's in there. Equals if. And I'm going to put this in a little bit of reverse order right here so it'll be easier to follow. We're going to want to use the find function or the search function. This is going to search a specific cell. Now the find function is case sensitive, which means if there are any capitalizations or anything like that, it has to exactly match. And the search function is case insensitive, which means capitalizations do not matter. Let's use the search function here. So open parentheses. What text do we want to find? Let's find the word good. And let's find it within this cell over here. And I don't care where it comes in the cell, so I'm not going to fill out the last argument for search, which is the starting number or position. So let's close parentheses. Now the thing with search is that if it does not find the word, it's going to return an error. If it does find the word, it's going to tell you at which position in the cell that word begins. So it's either going to return a number or an error. Now if it returns an error, the if function isn't going to work. As such, we need to surround the search function with the isNumber function. Now the isNumber function simply checks if something evaluates to a number or not. If it evaluates to a number, it's going to return a true. And the if function needs to use a true or a false value in order to work. So let's make sure we do the closing parentheses here around the search function. Let's output a true if it evaluates to true, and a false if it evaluates to false. So this cell does contain the word good, so we get a true. Now let's test it with a word that is not there, a good, false. Now just to show you, this is what it's going to look like if we remove the isNumber function and it cannot find the word. And that's not what we want from our if statement. So the only complex thing here is to remember the isNumber function. That's the easy one to forget because the search function and also the find function will work exactly the same way in returning an error value if it can't find that word within a cell. Change that back to good. There we go. Now let me show you an example of how to nest if statements. You probably already have the general idea of how to do this right now, and it's not that difficult, just can get a little confusing. So equals if. Let's check if this cell equals red. Now the value to return if that cell does equal red is, let's say, bad. However, if it is not red, then let's put our second if statement. So in the argument for value if false, and you could do this for any one of the arguments, value if true or value if false, it doesn't matter which one, it just has to follow the logic of what you're trying to do. So if E2 equals red, let's output the text bad. If it does not equal red, let's do another check. If, open parentheses, remember very easy to nest functions just like that. Now let's test if this cell here is greater than 10. So if it is greater than 10, let's output good. If it is not greater than 10, let's output bad. And make sure to do the last closing parentheses for the first if statement. So now what we've got here is if E2 equals red, output bad. If E2 does not equal red, check if E3 is greater than 10. If E3 is greater than 10 and E2 does not equal red, output good. Otherwise, output bad. Bad because this criteria equals red. Let's change it to green. Here you can see we get good. But if this is not greater than 10, we still get bad. I'll undo those changes here. So 10 will go back to 15, green to red. Now let's cover the last and most complex example for this tutorial. A nested if statement with multiple conditions and multiple functions. So let's go equals if. Let's do the and function to make sure both things will be equal. Let's say and E2 equals red. Let's say E3 is greater than 10. So if both of those are true, comma, let's move on to the very next if statement. If, open parentheses, let's check if this cell here, E4, has the word good anywhere within the cell. Remember, we have to use the isNumber function first. Then let's use the search function, so it's case insensitive. The text we want to find is good within this text over here. Doesn't matter where it comes in the cell, so don't fill out the last optional argument for start number. Then we close parentheses for the search function, close parentheses for the isNumber function, comma. Now what do we want to output if this evaluates to true? Let's just output good. If it doesn't evaluate to true, let's output bad. Close parentheses. Now this is closing the parentheses for the second if statement. Notice that the little argument list over here popped all the way back to the left to show you we're back at the first if statement and that we're still in the value if true argument. So we hit a comma. Now what do we want the first if statement to output if this test here evaluates to false? Well, let's also output bad for that. Then close the parentheses for the first if statement. And this returns good. Now let's run through this just to make sure everything is crystal clear. We have the first if function, and then for the illogical test, we have an and function, which means that both of these tests in here in the and function must evaluate to true in order for this if function to evaluate to true. So E2 must be red, E3 must be greater than 10 for it to evaluate to true. If it evaluates to true, then this right here, the value if true argument, is going to run. In this case, we put an if function in for that argument. Now, if any one of these checks in the and function evaluates to false, this over here, the value if false argument for the first if statement, is going to run, and it's going to output bad. If the and function evaluates to true, let's move to the value if true argument. Here we want to check if the cell E4 has the word good inside of it. So we use the search function because that is case insensitive. Search for the word good in the cell E4, and then we need to surround the search function with the isNumber function, because the search function is either going to return a number for the position of the word within the cell, or it's going to return an error. The isNumber function is going to say if what is contained within it is a number, which will be the result from the search function in this case, isNumber is going to return true. If the search function does not return a number, isNumber is going to return false. Now, if it does have the word good inside of it, cell E4, we will output good. If it doesn't, we output bad. Now to bring it all together and sum it up, what we're doing is this. Check if cell E2 equals red, check if cell E3 is greater than 10, and then check if cell E4 has the word good inside of it. And you could continue to nest if functions over here for the good or the bad or back here. So you can have as many if functions pretty much within reason as you need. It'll get more complex than you can handle before you'll run out of if functions that you can put within each other basically. Now you may have noticed that in this example, I could have put the isNumber and the search function here inside of the AND function over here. So I could have condensed it into one if function or if statement. However, I wanted to show you what it could look like when you nest them with multiple functions and multiple conditions. So now you've seen a bunch of different if statements in Excel, and you can see how they can start very simple and get very complex. The main thing is just have the logic sorted out in your head about exactly what you want to do, and then kind of try and put it in an if statement. But where possible, it's usually good practice to not make if statements too terribly complex, because if you come back to it in a month or a year or 2 years, you might kind of forget what you were trying to do, especially if you use more complex functions such as the VLOOKUP function or the mid function within your if statements. But as you can see, the if function is very powerful and is one of the backbone functions for Microsoft Excel. And just so you have it, I included one last example where I took the last function and put the isNumber and search section into the AND function. I hope you liked the tutorial. If it was helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and make sure to subscribe and accept notifications so you can see all the new tutorials.